Welcome to Wheelock's Latin, chapter 13. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at reflexive pronouns, reflexive possessive adjectives, and intensive pronouns. Now, as I always say, before you can take 2 steps forward, you've got to take at least 1 step backward. In order to learn new information, we've got to do a little bit of reviewing. So let's review our personal pronouns that we learned, I believe, in chapter 11. These personal pronouns, we had first and second person personal pronouns, and we had ego, mehi, mihi, me. In the plural was nos, nostrum, and nostri, nobis, nos, nobis. The translations were I and we, of me, of us, to me, or for me, to or for us, me or us, and then by, with, or from, me or us. In the plural, we had second person personal pronouns, tu, tui, tibi, te. In the plural side of that, we had wos, westrum or westri, wobis, wos, wobis. And the translation, of course, was you or y'all, depending on how it's used in the sentence. Now, we also had a third person personal pronoun. And of course, because third person can be he, she, or it, we have to have a masculine and a feminine and a neuter form. In the nominative, it was is, ia, id, genitive, wis, a wis. Dative was e, accusative id, and ablative o. If you remember, these follow the unusual pattern of the ius demonstrative pronouns. Ele, elat, lud, and este, esta, stood. In the genitive, it's got the ius ending. In the dative, the I ending. But in the rest of the forms, you've got basically first and second declension endings. And in the accusative. The neuter rule kicks in. Whatever's in the nominative is in the accusative. Ablative was o and a and o. And then, of course, all the endings for plural, e, aurum, is, os, is, and the feminine, I, aurum, is, as, is, and the neuter, a, aurum, is, a, is. So this is the third person personal pronouns. Now, a couple of things we want to make sure we take note of here. We do not use, here's our note, nota bene, first and second personal pronouns, first and second person personal pronoun. Genitives are not used for possession. I know we've always said that genitive is generally considered or functioning as possession, one of its main functions. But here, for personal pronouns in first and second person, the genitive does not function as an adjective. The genitive has a very specific function called a partitive genitive or an objective genitive, which we'll study much, much later. But we do use the genitive of the third person personal pronoun as possession. So here we have a wis, and it's his or her or its, and the plural et aurum is there. So first and second person, we use specifically a possessive adjective. First and second person uses a possessive adjective like meus aum for my, or noster, nostra, nostrum for our, or tuus aum for your, or wester, westra, westrum for your plural. So that's how we do possession for first and second person. But in third, we do use the genitive for the personal from the third person personal pronoun. So let's see if we can't give a few examples of these to help clear this up a little bit. Here's our first and second person personal pronoun chart. Here's a basic Latin sentence: ego Romam amo, I love Rome. So here we're going to take ego, which of course is the nominative first person singular pronoun, and it's I, and that's simply translated as the subject I. Now, as you know, Romans did not need to have the pronoun because the I is basically encompassed in the ending for the verb amo. O is the first person singular ending for present tense. So we already know without that ego, if we just had Romam amo, it would say I love Rome. But when the Romans wanted to emphasize something, they would use the pronoun. So here they're emphasizing I love Rome. So that's why they would use these. Here's another example here. Let's look at nos Romam amamus. We love Rome. Here we would take nos, which is the first person plural nominative, nos, and it's the pronoun here that stands for we, and so it's just we love Rome. Look at another example here. How about vos amamus? This translates to we love you all. And here we take the vos, which is the second person accusative plural personal pronoun, vos. We love y'all. This is the direct object of the verb amo, amamus. All right, let's try one more. Now, this time we're using an example from the third person chart. Is populum huis amat. Here we have is, which is the nominative masculine singular pronoun, he. And then we're going to take the huis, which is the genitive masculine singular. And it's he loves his nation. Now, we got a little note here. Notice that this is not his own nation. This is someone else's nation. This sentence is communicating this person, whoever the subject is, whoever he is, he's loving somebody else's nation, not his own. If we wanted to indicate, the Roman wanted to indicate that he loved his own nation, we're going to use the reflexive pronoun, which we're going to look at here in just a minute. But the reflexive pronoun would mean he loves his own nation. Here we simply have he loves his nation. Who the his is, we don't really know. Context would have to tell you. Here's another example. Ei populum eorum amant. All right, we've got ei. Again, this is the masculine plural nominative for the subject, ei. We got eorum, the genitive masculine plural, and it's they love their nation. They love their nation. All right. If we need to, we'll talk about it some more in class. But right now, let's look at the next part of this chapter, which is the reflexive pronouns. Reflexive pronouns are pronouns that bend back or reflect back towards the subject. Here's a couple examples in English. I love myself. This is a reflexive pronoun. It is reflecting back to the subject I. I love myself. Here we have you love yourself. Yourself is the reflexive pronoun. It's reflecting or bending back to the subject you. And here we have she loves herself. And herself is the reflexive pronoun reflecting back to the subject she. So for each of these, the subjects are either first or second or third person. And so the reflexive pronouns had to be accordingly first or second or third person. And of course, singular or plural, depending on the subject. Now, as far as the form goes for these reflexive pronouns, the good news is they're exactly the same as the personal pronouns that we've already learned. But if you will notice, there is no nominative. The reason why is because the word will always be bending back towards or reflecting the subject. Therefore, it cannot be the subject. So there will never be a nominative form for this reflexive pronoun. So it's the way we kind of run through the chart is blank, mehi, mihi, meh, meh. Blank, tui, tibi, te, te. In the plural, it's nostri, blank, nostri, nobis, nos nobis. Second person, blank, westri, wobis, wos, wobis. But I do want you to notice we've added a third person reflexive pronoun. And this is different than the third person personal pronoun, is, ia, id, where we had a masculine, feminine, and a neuter form. Its pattern is similar to first and second reflexive here, as you can see, but instead of the M or the T, it's going to have an S. And notice also that the singular and plural are identical for the third person reflexive pronoun. So again, here's the first person, blank, mehi, mihi, meh, meh. Plural, blank, tui, tibi, I shouldn't say plural, I mean second person, blank, tui, tibi, te, te. And for third person, blank, sui, sibi, se, se. And here's the plural first person, blank, nostri, nobis, nos nobis. Second person plural, blank, westri, wobis, wos, wobis. And notice again here that the plural third person is identical third singular, blank, sui, sibi, se, se. So these are the reflexive pronouns. Let's look at a few examples that might help us see how these relate to one another. Here's our first sentence. Ego me monao. I remind myself. If you remember, ego here is the first person pronoun, but me is the reflexive pronoun accusative. So this me is reflecting back or bending back towards ego. I remind myself. How about this one? Tu me mones. You remind me. Here, both of these are simply personal pronouns. Even though in both sentences we have the form me, you have ego me and tu me. But the first one, it's reflecting back because ego is first person and me is first person. It's bending back, reflecting back to the subject. In the second example, tu is second person personal pronoun and me is first person. So it can't be reflecting or bending back towards that subject. It's simply you remind me. Tu me mones. Let's try another couple examples. How about nos paramus? We prepare ourselves. Here we have nos, which is the first person plural nominative form, personal pronoun, stands for we. And then we've got nos, which is the accusative first person plural. There it is, reflexive pronoun. It is bending back or reflecting on the subject, nos. We prepare ourselves. Again, a similar sentence, tu nos paras, you prepare us. But this time again, nos is not reflecting or bending back towards the subject. It is simply a personal pronoun, us. So you prepare us. All right, let's try one more example, this time using the third person. Is se negligit. Here we have is, which is, of course, the third person masculine singular, he. And we have se, which is the third person accusative reflexive pronoun singular. He neglects himself. And this is bending back or reflecting on the subject, he. He neglects himself. One more example here. Ei se negligunt. They neglect themselves. Here we have ei, which is the masculine plural nominative pronoun, and we have se, which is the accusative plural third person reflexive pronoun, and it is bending back or reflecting on the subject ei. They neglect themselves. All right, so that is the reflexive pronoun. Now let's review here, before we look at reflective possessive adjectives, let's review our possessive adjectives. If you remember, Latin uses the following possessive adjectives to indicate possession for first and second person. We have meus noster, nostra, nostrum, tuus, tua, tuum, and vester, vestra, vestrum. Here's a chart for first person, and it simply translates as my, meus mei, 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 etc. This is basically a first and second declension adjective in all its forms. Let's look at a couple of examples to help us remember how we use them. Filius, meus, magnus. Meus is the masculine nominative singular, and it simply modifies or describes filius, which is also masculine nominative singular. My son is great. Okay, let's look at this example. Filia mea est magna. My daughter is great. Again, mea is the feminine nominative singular, describing filia. It is acting as an adjective modifying filia. So my daughter is great. Let's try a neuter example. Donum meum est magnum. My gift is great. Meum is the nominative neuter singular modifying donum. Possessive adjective modifying donum. So my gift is great. How about a plural version? How about dona mea sunt magna? My gifts are great. Here, mea is the nominative neuter plural. There it is. And it is modifying dona as a possessive adjective, describing it. It's my gifts are great. All right. How about another example? This time we're going to have two versions here. Mater mea dona mea amat. My mother, here, mea is the feminine nominative singular, describing mater. And then we have mea, which is neuter accusative plural, describing dona. Both of these are possessive adjectives. My mother loves my gifts. One more example. Here we have mater mea amicos meos amat. My mother loves my friends. Again, mea is the feminine nominative singular, describing mater. And then we have meos, which is the accusative plural masculine, describing amicos. Both of these are possessive adjectives describing their respective nouns, mater and amicos. My mother loves my friends. All right, now this works for all of the adjectives. This is the first person plural, our, noster, nostra, nostrum. Also the second person possessive adjective, your, tuus, tua, tuum. And then the second person plural form, which is your, or your, you are, y'all's, there we go, y'all's, wester, westra, westrum. And so all of these would function the same way. Okay, so that has been review of the possessive adjectives, but let's look at the new part we're going to learn here in chapter 13, reflexive possessive adjectives. So if you remember, the first and second person reflexive possessive adjectives are identical to the possessive adjectives already learned. To this, we're going to add the third person reflexive possessive adjectives using the familiar pattern that we have already learned. The difference between these two Reflexive possessive adjectives will be reflecting or bending back towards the subject. Possessive adjectives simply describe or modify a noun. So let's take a look at the forms here. Again, this is the possessive adjectives that we just reviewed. First person singular, first person plural, right? My or our. And in second person your or y'all's. Okay? Tuus, tua, tuum, and wester, westra, westrum. Now here is the reflexive possessive adjectives. And if you'll notice, the charts are exactly the same. The only difference is how we're translating it. Here, first person, meus, meat, meum, is my own. In first person plural, instead of our, it's our own. And second person singular, your, tuus, tua, tuum, is your own. And second person plural, wester, westra, westrum, is your own. Okay, or y'all's own for us Texans, all right? So these are exactly the same forms. Here's the chart side by side. The possessive adjectives on the left, my, our, your, and your, and the reflexive possessive adjectives on the right, my own, our own, your own, and y'all's own. All right? Now, let's look at just the reflexive possessive adjectives for third person. This is new for us. If you remember, third person did not have a possessive adjective, since the genitive of the third person personal pronoun, ewis, functions as the possessive for third person. However, we do need a reflexive possessive adjective. So we have a new form here, suu, sua, suum. But that pattern ought to look real familiar. Meus, mea, meum, or tuus, tua, tuum. It's the same form, but instead of an M or a T, I guess I should go ahead and pull that up forward there. Instead of an M or a T, it's going to be an S. So nota bene, like all adjectives, it must agree in case, number, and gender with the noun that it modifies. However, in English, we have to translate it according to the gender and number and the subject of the subject to which it refers. So here we have suu, sua, suum, and sui, soai, suu, suo, suai, suo, etc. These are just simply first and second declension adjectives. All right, let's look at a couple examples, see if we can't put this into perspective here. Here's a sentence, poeta filium suum amavit. The poet loved his own son. Here we have suum, which is the masculine accusative singular form of the reflexive possessive adjective. And it's simply describing filium, right, because they're both accusative, masculine singular, but it is bending back or reflecting on the subject. The poet loved his own son. That's the difference between, if we wanted to say he loved somebody else's son, we would say this, poeta filium vis amavit. The poet loved his son. This is somebody else's son. So this is a personal pronoun here. Vis is simply the personal pronoun genitive functioning as a possessive. Poeta filium vis amavit. All right, so here's how you indicate specificity. And in English, we don't really have that. We say he loved his son. You're like, whose son? His own son? Somebody else's son? He ate his lunch. Did he eat his lunch? Did he eat somebody else's lunch? Here in Latin, we have the benefit of specificity. In Latin, if they wanted you to know he is doing something to his own, in this example, the poet loved his own son, you use suum, one of the reflexive possessive adjectives. If you want it to indicate he's loving somebody else's son, you simply use a genitive third person personal pronoun, vis. The poet loved his son, poeta filium vis amavit. All right, let's look at another couple examples. Here we go. Romani virtutum suam laudaverunt. The Romans praised their own virtue. Here, suam is the accusative feminine singular, and it is matching virtutum because it's describing virtutum, so it's accusative feminine singular. But it's bending back, reflecting on the subject, Romani. The Romans praised their own virtue. All right? Now, however, if the Romans, Romani virtutum eorum laudaverunt, if the Romans praised their virtue, here this is not their own virtue, this is someone else's virtue. In this case, maybe it's the Greeks. So Romani virtutum eorum laudaverunt. So because we're not doing our own virtue here, the Romans' own virtue, we're not using the reflexive possessive adjective, we're using the personal pronoun eorum. The Romans praised their virtue. So again, here's the difference between the reflexive possessive adjective and which has to match the case, number, and gender of the word that it's modifying. An example of the first example, it's virtutum, accusative, feminine singular. The second example, it is just a pronoun, and it needs to reflect its antecedent in gender and in number. Let's look at a couple more examples here. Here we have ego, filium, meum. There we go. Ego, filium, meum vidi. I saw my own son. Right? Meum is the accusative masculine singular. It is reflecting back on the personal pronoun ego, I. I saw my own son. Not anybody else's son, my son. Here's another example. Ego kuma mikis meis veni. Meis is the ablative masculine, and it's ablative plural, and it's reflecting or bending back to the subject ego. I came with my own friends, but it matches in case, number, and gender with amicis because it is an adjective modifying amici, so it has to be ablative and plural. All right, very good. So that's our reflexive possessive adjectives. Let's look at the last new thing for this chapter, intensive pronouns. The intensive pronoun was used to emphasize a noun or pronoun in either the subject or the predicate. And the translations can include myself or ourselves, yourself or yourselves, himself, herself, itself, or themselves. And it can also be translated as the very or the actual. Now, here's the chart. Ipse, ipsa, ipsum. Now, if you notice, nota bene, this is going to follow the pattern of the demonstrative pronouns ele, ala, lud, and este, esta, stood, where in the genitive we have an ius ending across masculine, feminine, neuter, singular, and we have a I ending in the dative, singular, masculine, feminine, and neuter. But the rest of the forms, accusative, and ablative singular, and all the plural, simply follow the pattern of first and second declension nouns and adjectives. So let's take a look here. We've got ipse, ipsa, ipsum, but in the genitive we have ipsuis, ipsuis, ipsuis. So the stem is IPS. We're adding the IUS ending here. In the dative, we're going to add an I ending, so it's ipsi, ipsi, ipsi. In the neuter, it's ipsum, ipsam, ipsum. The UM is the normal masculine accusative ending. AM is the normal feminine accusative ending. And of course, we have the neuter rule. Whatever's in the nominative must be in the accusative. And of course, the ablative O ending, and O, ipso, ipsa, ipso. And the plural, we usually just run these going down vertically here. The masculine is ipsi, ipsorm, ipsis, ipsos, ipsis. It's got the E, orum, isos, is. The feminine endings I, arum, is, as, is. And the neuter, a, orum, is, a, is. Let's look at just a few examples of these, and we'll be done. Here we go. Cicero ipse me amavit. Cicero himself loved me. Here we have ipse, which is the nominative masculine singular intensive pronoun, and it is intensifying Cicero himself. And then we have me, which is simply the accusative singular personal pronoun, me. Cicero loved me. Cicero himself loved me. Cicero ipse me amavit. Cicero himself loved me. Let's look at one more. Here we have Cicero me ipsum amavit. Cicero loved me myself. Again, we got me, which is the accusative personal pronoun, but we have ipsum, which is the accusative singular masculine intensive pronoun, and it is modifying me, so it must agree in case, number, and gender. Cicero loved me myself. So this is the intensive pronouns. Again, it can be myself, yourself. It just depends on what, or himself or herself or any of those, depends on what it's intensifying. In the first sentence here, it intensified Cicero, so we translate it as himself. In the second example here, it intensified me, so we translate it myself. So don't forget to study your vocabulary. This is our lesson, and we'll get together this week and see how we're doing.